Mark. So um, obviously people will still continue to log in, but welcome everyone and thank you for joining our presentation on how to improve survey data quality for your research. My name is Rodley Raphael and I'm the president of Question Pro Audience. Question Pro Audience is the division within Question Pro that specializes in developing and managing niche panel communities, giving our clients access to more than 20 million respondents online and across the globe. So naturally, this topic is not foreign to us. We've dealt with it in some form or another, and it's dear to us, and it's something that we're interested in as well to see in what capacity we can make some changes in-house ourselves. So when it comes to data quality, it's obviously an issue that affects both vendors and buyers. There are many factors that affect data quality. However, the solutions I often see, it's typically one-sided, with survey respondents carrying the brunt of the blame as it relates to data quality. Our goal for this webinar is really to dissect the issue from both methodology, quantitative and qualitative, and using both approach to look at some of the solutions that we can come to when it comes to data quality issues that we face in day-to-day research. So therefore, the agenda that we have for us for this presentation, we'll take a look at data quality overall, some of the data quality issues that you may face on a day-to-day research practice, conversion rates in your surveys, and from a qualitative standpoint, we'll be looking at interviewer training. Speaker today has a lot of experience in that arena, and he'll be spending a little bit of time on that as well. Reducing non-response bias in surveys, very important, and also questionnaire design, all the element that involves when it comes to questionnaire constructions as well. So this should be a very interesting presentation, something that affects the industry a lot, and it's been talked about a lot, but it seems like year to year, there's not really a definitive solution. But this time around for this presentation, we want to put the focus on the research practitioner, him or herself. But first, let me introduce our speaker, our guest speaker for this presentation. It's a pleasure to have John Barret, who is president of Priority Metrics Group, a B2B industrial research firm with offices in both US and Latin America. John has over 20 years of experience in the research industry, and he's considered to be an expert in customer satisfaction research, strategic market analysis and planning, and he's worked on both the quantitative and qualitative side of the research medium, so he knows what he's doing. John also holds an MBA and a PhD in marketing, and without further delay, I would like to pass the control over to John. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Rudley, very much. It's good to be with you and with our electronic audience. And we look forward to sharing some insights and tips and objectives, our perspective on some of these issues with you this afternoon, or this morning if you happen to be on the Pacific Coast. As Rudley said, these are the things that we want to cover today in our presentation. And so we do have quite a bit of material to get into. So let's just kind of pick up our boots and let's get walking. When we talk about data quality, this quote from Donald Rumsfeld does, I think, bear on the issue. And while it's a little bit funny to read quickly, I think his insight here is pretty keen and relevant to us. There are things that we know, then there are things that we know we don't know. But the challenge really is those unknowns, those things we don't know that we don't know. And that is particularly relevant when we're talking about data quality, because we're very good at addressing the first category, pretty good at addressing the second category, but obviously can't address something we don't know. So we're going to try and introduce some of those today and work through those with you. So when we think about how important data quality is, this chart I think is very interesting. There was a study done by a leading research firm asking about the most important objectives of marketing data strategy. And as you can see on the chart here, they examined or included a number of different possibilities: data analytics, integrating sales and marketing data, technology utilization, et cetera. But clearly, the overwhelming most important objective of marketing data strategy was improving data quality. And it really kind of stands by itself. You know, almost 2/3 of respondents chose that as their most important objective, compared to the other 6 that were included in this particular study. As we think about you know, where the sources of error might come from, there are really 3 categories here, and these were developed by Groves. And there are categories of error that include coverage, measurement effect, and non-response effect. And you can see the definitions here, and I don't need to read through those with you, but these are all inclusive in terms of the types of error that are typically addressed. I think we can look at this on a little more friendly basis in the cartoon here, and you can see you know, Dogbert Research is coming in asking a question about a particular product. That is an example really of measurement effect. How is the issue measured? And again, that's dealing with the construction to ensure that there's a reliable response. The last panel, you know, when he is kind of joking here that there's you know, a total of 1 respondent in his sample, is a non-response effect, where we've got an issue around is the sample a truly random sample, and does it reflect the population in such a way that non-respondents don't have some systematic difference from respondents? So if let's dive into the non-response problem. And the graphic here kind of illustrates the issue. If we've got a sample of individuals, and let's say we've got these you know, 12 or 16 individuals here, the ones that are circled would be included in our sample. The ones that are not circled are really the problem of non-response. And the question again is, do those individuals differ in some kind of systematic way from those that are in the sample? So we're going to look at 2 issues today: non-response and questionnaire design. And we thought it would be interesting to take a poll of the audience and to try and understand, you know, of the various dimensions of data quality, what are the most important 3 in your particular area of research? I understand that the link here does not work, so if you could look at the chat window on your screen in the webinar. If you can click on that chat, there'll be a link in that chat box that will take you to this interactive poll. And we're going to give you just 45 or 60 seconds here to take that poll, and then we'll provide the results just a little bit later. So I'm going to pause for just a minute and give you the opportunity to answer, you know, among these 8 potential issues dealing with data quality, what are the most important 3 as it relates to your research?
And John, just to clarify, we're going to have our attendees take this poll, and we'll publish the result of the poll at the end of the webinar as well, and put it on our website, make it available for them on our website.
Let's dive into non-response. That's the first topic that we want to cover this afternoon. And again, the non-response problem is, does the balance of the population outside of our sample differ in a systematic way from those that are included in the sample? And so one of the first things that we would suggest is that you use AAPOR categories. That's the American Association for Public Opinion Research. And they have published a directory, and this is easily accessible on the web. You can find this document very, very quickly just by Googling this. And they have 4 categories that are included in their guidelines. Interview, that's or success, and then 3 broad categories of others, which would include a person that is eligible but was not interviewed, a respondent or non-respondent of unknown eligibility, a non-interview, and then someone who is not eligible. And there are several subcategories under this. But the reason why this is important is because now we've got standard definitions that can be compared across surveys. And this is the first step in trying to identify correlates of non-response. And since it's very difficult to interview non-respondents by definition, this is a way that we can begin to understand why are people not responding, and can we see any pattern here that would be indicative of non-response bias. There have been several studies done looking at non-response, and one of the interesting findings that is pretty consistent is that response rates are frequently not related to non-response bias. There is a general kind of perception, or almost it's become a maxim, that the way you reduce non-response bias is to get a higher response rate. And that certainly makes sense intuitively. However, many studies have shown that is not in fact the case. If we look at this chart on the left of this slide, you can see that each of these indicators on the chart running from left to right are different waves in a survey that actually had a 95% overall response rate. So wave 1 had a lower response rate all the way over to wave 5, which finally resulted in a 95% response rate. And the high-low there on the chart is indicative of the confidence interval, which obviously decreases as we get a higher response rate. And then the midpoint is the average on a multi-item scale that was tracked. And the interesting thing is that while the precision increased, that is the narrowness of the confidence interval, the precision increased as the response rate did. The threshold representing an adequate response rate did not. In other words, we did not see any indication that there was a non-response bias, and that mean did not change in a significant way as we moved to a higher level of response. Another critical way of addressing the non-response issue is by conversion, basically working to convert non-respondents to respondents. And there are a variety of ways that we can do that. One is by modifying the survey introduction, using different introductions to appeal to different types of respondents. Another is by looking at the contact rules. What are the rules of engagement, as it were, for the survey, and can those be modified in any way to try and improve our potential response rate? We can also look at incentives. We'll talk about incentives a little bit more in just a couple of slides. And then lastly, interviewer style and training. For many surveys, particularly quant surveys, the interviewer has limited ability to insert their own personality, by design. But where there is that opportunity, that personality, their style, their demeanor can have a significant impact on response rate. And so the literature, if you do kind of a meta study of literature looking at conversion, is that when we talk about telephone surveys, that conversion rates can range between 5 and 40%. So there's a pretty significant potential impact on the overall response rate. Another area that is often overlooked is interviewer hiring practice and interviewer training. Our basic conclusion here is that the right person can make a very significant difference in overall response rate. And first of all, that comes from hiring practice. Are we getting really the best people, the right people, people that are incented properly, people that want to do surveys? That can come through in tone, even when there's limited opportunity for flexibility or variance in how the survey questions are presented. Also, interviewer training is a key and often overlooked area. Going over the survey background so that people really understand what are we trying to get out of this survey. Questionnaire familiarity, so there's no hesitation at all when it comes to reading the introduction, describing the purpose of the survey, and then going through skip patterns, et cetera, or reading through words that may be multisyllabic or a little uncomfortable for some of the interviewers. We follow a 5-second rule, and that is that we've got to, in 5 seconds, be able to hit the key points of an introduction and why we're doing the survey. Now, our introduction may be longer than that, but that 5 seconds, that first sentence, is critical to ensuring that we have the highest opportunity of maintaining that individual on the phone or through a face-to-face contact. Also look at timing of the contact. Are we catching the respondent at the right time of day? And then lastly, multiple contacts. Trying different times during the day and the week, and just increasing our opportunities for response rate. And there are a couple of other things that we need to remember in terms of trying to reduce non-response bias. The ones at the top there, good survey design and good survey communication. We've put a kind of note that's clever foreshadow. It really gets into what we're going to talk about in just a minute when we look at questionnaire and question construction. But we really want to focus on this slide on incentives. And again, the chart on the right is illustrative of the impact of incentives. Again, it's looking at a sequential measurement of a mailed survey, and where incentives were used with a solid line and no incentives on the bottom. That response rate increases, but there is a substantial and significant additional response rate that was generated through the use of incentives. And that increase in this case is on the order of 15 to 20 percentage points, which is not atypical. A couple of guidelines though on using incentives. One is to not cross what we refer to as a coercive threshold. For consumer surveys, that tends to be around $5. And what we mean by that is above $5 tends to be viewed as shifting from a reasonable incentive to putting me in an uncomfortable position where I feel obligated to do the survey. And obviously there's additional cost that may be unnecessary in increasing that incentive beyond that level. In the B2B world, incentives are often more effective as a donation to a designated charity or to a predetermined charity. In many cases, business executives are not allowed to take any type of compensation for completing a survey. There also is a fairly large body of research that concludes that prepaid incentives are more effective than promised incentives. And it doesn't need to be large. Many studies have looked at just using $1, including a dollar with the questionnaire, which has a significant impact on response rate. In general, differences decrease with follow-up. You can see that on the chart on the right as we start moving from the fourth contact to the last in this chart, that the relative gain from using an incentive declines slightly, and that's consistent with many other studies. And then another interesting thing that, again, has been shown through multiple studies is that incentives often lead to lengthier open-end responses, which are very useful in evaluating open-end or qualitative kind of response. And then lastly, again, something that we almost never hear about as a way to reduce non-response bias is to ask our interviewers for any type of feedback that they can provide on why individuals did not complete a survey. And whether it's done through an intercept type environment on the left or via telephone on the right, there are a number of characteristics that can be captured about those non-respondents that can help in understanding, again, what are those correlates of non-response. Things like just observable characteristics. Were non-respondents more likely to be to vary by gender, age, sex, ethnic background, et cetera. What were their subjective evaluations of just engagement or honesty? Were people lying to us when they said they didn't want to respond? And what was the interviewer's assessment of the real reason? And then were there any kind of visual clues or verbal clues over the phone, that would help us understand why individuals were not responding? So all of these can help us, lead back to the point where we can understand what are those key correlates of non-response, and now we have something hard and substantive to begin to address the non-response problem. Okay, so that kind of gets us through the non-response. Obviously, we haven't addressed that fully, but there are several key takeaways that we'll summarize towards the end of the presentation today that I think might be helpful. We want to move on to the questionnaire design and construction. And, a big issue here is we can ask the right questions, but we want to make sure that we're asking a complete set of questions. In this case, not just loyalty, enthusiasm, but what kind of animal are you? But we also want to address, are we asking the questions at the right time? Are we asking them in the right way? Are we asking them with the right wording and getting at the correct issues? So asking the correct questions, to reduce that aspect of validity is just one part of the challenge. So we would suggest that when you think about constructing a questionnaire, that you really start with the end in mind. And so as you think about writing those questions is, first of all, understand what are the objectives of the study, how do those objectives translate into deliverables, and then the deliverables translate into questions. That path has proven to be extremely valuable, not only in questionnaire design, but in actually delivering a final product which is successful and well received by the client. So what are some of these good design practices? One clearly is promise anonymity, or at least offer anonymity or confidentiality very clearly in the survey. If you can, establish some form of relationship, because that has been proven to increase response rate. What we mean by that is obviously something like an existing customer. There's a strong relationship there. But even if we can introduce a known brand or a use occasion or something else that can tie the respondent to the survey, that will increase response rate. Simplify the perceived task. We always struggle trying to preserve white space. Clients typically want to load up the questionnaire with questions, but white space leads to better answers and a higher response rate. Also, a logical flow. In many cases, people think about a questionnaire as more of a scientific instrument and design it from their perspective as opposed to the respondent's perspective. And for the respondent, it's extremely helpful to have a flow so they can follow from point A to point B to point C. And so group common items together. Don't ask unnecessary questions. I don't know how many times we've been constructing a survey and the client will say something to the effect of, and include all the regular demographic questions. And when pressed a little further, they really can't tell us what they're going to do with those demographic answers. Does it make any difference if someone is black or white or old or young or male or female? In many cases, it doesn't. Also avoid the use of jargon or any type of other notation, things that respondents may have difficulty understanding. Again, there have been many studies done that have shown that respondents will try to answer based on visual or auditory clues that are provided for them in the interview process before they will ask for a definition. And then where you are able, for example, with URLs or Caddy or whatever type of systems you might be using, use page logic or question logic to allow the construction of questions or the presentation of questions that are more suitable for the respondent based on their answers to prior questions. So let's look at an example here. There's a couple of kind of positives and negatives. Here's a typical kind of one-page shopper impression survey. On the left-hand side, we've listed some of the positives. It's very clean. There's white space. It's got a logical flow. The attributes are listed on the top. It's got an open-end response, a couple of multiple choice questions on the bottom, and a very simple kind of form, which is good. And there's good comment space there. Some negatives. When we look at the top section, although they ask about importance and performance, they really never explain what are we asking for here. And so they're assuming that the respondent is going to understand the task that is being given, which is not usually a good assumption. If we look at some of the wording on the questions, they ask, for example, one of the questions is, what electronics have you purchased in the last 12 months? And then there's a list of electronics, but we're not really sure what else would be included. For example, they list, TVs, game consoles, et cetera, but would something like an appliance be included as an electronic? A universal remote control. It's not clear what is and is not considered to be electronic. Towards the bottom there, they ask about your zip code and this store. This store being what? This store where I shopped. This store where I purchased, etc. Okay, let's move on. Another key area is the visual display. Couple of guidelines here: no more than 4 visual elements on a page, and use the elements very carefully and sparingly. Things like colors, boldface, highlights. There's a tendency to overuse that. It's very easy to overuse those. The next page here shows an example of what we're talking about, and this is really a bad example. Again, we can see the logic that someone might use in constructing a questionnaire like this, and so there is a flow to it. We can see each question, but when we look at this, rather than having 4 visual elements, it looks like there's 30 or 40 or 50 visual elements, and so it becomes so confusing that the survey is essentially worthless. It's almost impossible to follow. Everything becomes bright, everything becomes important. Some other guidelines on question construction is to use conversational norms. That is, words that are normally considered plural, leave them as plural. Data is a great example. Technically, data is a plural noun. That's not commonly used. Most people, when they talk about data, they talk about it in singular. We're writing a questionnaire using the concept or the word data, use it as a singular. That's the common usage. Use few syllables, use words that are not difficult to pronounce. When we talk about using open-end versus closed-end, we would suggest that you use open-end for numeric answers, such as what is the percentage of this, or at what time did you, or that type of a question, and use categorical questions when there are an unknown breadth of possible answers. And then a couple of kind of guidelines that we use in developing questions we want to share with you. One is Grice's maxims. Grice was a linguistic philosopher. Many of us, including myself, really were not aware that was even a profession in this world, but it is, and he's got some good guidelines here about thinking about how communication happens. One is quantity. We want to give only as much information as is necessary and no more. Second is quality. We want to give good, meaningful, truthful information. Third is relation, where we provide information that's pertinent and hence not information that's not pertinent or relevant. And the last is manner. We try and be clear and we avoid any ambiguity in how the question is constructed. A second model that we would suggest is very useful to question construction is the Tarango model. And this is the conceptualization of how people think about a question. And so we start with comprehension, how someone understands the question. A second is retrieval, then recalling the information necessary to answer that question. A third would be judgment, then deciding if I have sufficient information, and then how will I transform that question into a response. And then finally, a response. If you can use these 4 categories in this kind of cycle of translation from the request to a response, it can help to ensure that our questions are constructed in a way that makes sense and are useful and will result in good, meaningful data. So let me show just a couple of quick examples of what might be bad questions. Some of these are a little obvious, some a little less obvious. One would be, what is your frequency of utilization of retail travel agents? Why not just say, how often do you use a travel agent? Are you against a restrictive House Bill 935? Obviously, that's a leading question. There's no need to talk about restrictive or any other kind of adjectives that would describe what we're asking about. Question 3, have you visited whatever it might be, the hotel or park or this business in the past, and did you enjoy your visit? We're really asking 2 questions. Question 4 is a little bit different. You might say, well, what's wrong with a rank order question? The issue there is, are we really asking the right question? We're forcing people to rank order when the ordinal response may be good. In other words, it may be 1 to 7, but the ratio may differ. So for example, 1 and 2 may be critical, and 3 through 7 may be non-factors in their decision-making process. So there are some other examples that we can go through, but I think you get the idea, and we're going to share the material with you. So I think you can get the idea of how you use some of these points to develop good questions. Just a couple of other points, and then we'll be moving on to conclusions here. One is rating scales. A couple of guidelines on how to use rating scales. One, ensure that you use words and not just numbers. There's nothing wrong with using a number, but make sure that you use words to describe the scale, and ideally describe every point on the scale. It's great to use anchor points or anchor descriptors on a 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 scale, but if possible, describe every point. That way there's a greater likelihood of getting a consistent understanding and response. We would suggest that for bipolar constructs, use a 7-point scale, and for single constructs, use a 5-point scale. We could have a whole webinar on scale construction, but from our experience, this tends to work best. We would also suggest not offering a don't know response. It invites people to take the easy way out and to click on that response. And then lastly, of course, rotate the order response on any kind of categorical questions and wherever else it's possible or practical, just to ensure that we're getting good data and there's no order effect in the response. And then the last point that we would suggest is to develop a solid, well thought out communication plan. And what we mean by that is things like an invitation or an advance letter. Don't just assume that we can send that questionnaire to anybody and they have nothing better to do than to respond to our survey. If it's a self-administered questionnaire, make sure that the explanation is complete, that it's done in such a way that there's respect for the individual and respect for their time, and as opposed to operating under the assumption that they will or they must or they're under obligation to participate. And then reminder letters and emails. We like to think of this as, position this as a very high level and serious communication, as you would in the B2B world if it were a price increase, or in the consumer world if you were sharing some personal financial information with the individual. And then lastly is a pretest. I'm going to skip the first point here just in the interest of time, but the second point there is dealing with a think aloud. It's basically the idea of testing a questionnaire and asking the individual testing to verbalize their thought process. So as they go through the questionnaire, to think out loud with you literally about what their what they're thinking, what they're recalling, how they're making their choice, what assumptions they're making. And so we have a better understanding of not just the responses on a pretest, but the actual process behind getting to those answers. I love a little cartoon here, the little reincarnation disappointment. Just illustrates the point of really understanding what people are saying and thinking, not hippie, but hippo. So in summary, we've got a couple of conclusions. First of all, around non-response bias, document and categorize non-responses, look for correlations, and that's also number 8, gathering information from interviewers, what we were just talking about. Number 3, don't be fooled by high response rate. It's not always an indicator that non-response bias has been addressed or vice versa. Convert those non-respondents whenever you can, wherever possible, and build your process to do that. Hire the best interviewers and train them well. It makes a big difference in response rate and response quality. And use a well-designed questionnaire with thoughtful incentives. And then moving on to the question and questionnaire construction. Again, a couple of takeaways that we want to leave you with. One, start with the end in mind. Where are we trying to go? So don't include anything that's not necessary to get to that end. Follow good design principles, which we've outlined here. Wherever possible, establish a relationship through brand, some other type of connection. When you're using visual elements, use them carefully. Craft questions that are clear and direct. Test against both Grice's maxims and that Tarango model. Those are both good tools to use in evaluating the quality of your final instrument. Including rating scales, make sure that you do so based upon prior research, like what number of scale points to use, making sure that you use verbal descriptors over each point. And then develop a communication plan that's consistent with your objectives and with the methodology that you choose. And lastly, of course, pretest. And if there's any question, if there's any issue that comes up, pretest again, make sure that you're completely confident before going to the field. As many on the call know, once you're out in the field, it's too late to make any changes. Okay, that gets us through everything. We've had to move kind of quickly. And so I think I'm going to hand it back over to Rudley, and we'll take any questions at this point.
Awesome, John. Thank you very much. Great presentation, very informative, and appreciate your time doing this here. At this point, we started a little bit behind. We'd like to take some questions from the audience, and we're gonna have a few coming in momentarily here and have either John or myself address them. You know, coming from the quant side, John, and I know you do a lot of qualitative stuff as well. One of the first questions I'm looking at here is, you know, what kind of strategies do you put in place when you're looking at your data file and you have people who are speeders? You know, they're not taking the survey within that allotted time. What strategy would you put in place to address that issue?
Well, there's a couple of things that I would suggest, Rudley. One is to remember that we want a logical flow, and so by grouping the questions together, and like for example in a that really is more of an issue, you know, in self-administered. So I guess let me back up just a second. In a caddy kind of environment, we have control over that, but in a self-administered, you can group those by category. And so only present so many per page, and that can slow them down a little bit.
Okay.
You can also put some, time controls on that could, build in lags. You could do some follow-up to make sure that people are answering correctly. So, we can go back to those individuals and do some follow-up questions. So there are a variety of different things you can do to try and slow them down a little bit. But I think the biggest issue really to address that, it goes back to sample selection, is making sure we've got the right people. Right. If we have the right people, then we've got a better chance at getting people who are genuinely interested in the subject matter.
Okay. Another question I'm getting here is oftentimes, and I think this relates to the online methodology, oftentimes when I'm purchasing sample or conducting a survey with a panel provider, I'm not really sure whether or not those people are real. What kind of things can I put in place to make sure that the people who are taking the surveys are real?
Well, I think this is kind of similar to the robot checks, and they're on many websites. We can put checks in the questionnaire, which would indicate, whether it is just a random completion that's occurring. Obviously we can look for patterns in the responses. We look at the quality and depth of open-end responses. So there's a variety of things that we can do to check to make sure that those are real respondents.
Okay. And coming from, the vendor side, one of the things, we do as well is we'll apply trap questions. We'll do a double filter, a double screener, meaning we have profiling data on our own panel, and then we'll add demographic data on the survey itself. If these two don't correlate, we typically just kick that person out. So that's a red flag for us. So that's one thing I would say. This is one way, depending on who your sample provider might be, that's something you can ask them to do. Either you, as the research practitioner, you can kind of add trap questions in there. Ask them who's the current president of the United States. If the survey is about information technology, you can ask them certain things about networking, and just to check and make sure that person is who he or she say that they are. The other question I'm getting here is pertaining to incentive. What is there a rule to the proper incentive to offer for a survey?
Yeah, good question. There's no rule, Rudley, but I think there are some guidelines. One that we've found is make the incentive appropriate to the audience. For many consumer type studies, the incentive does not need to be large. As we noted in the presentation, a prepaid incentive is much more effective than a promised incentive. And in general, I think the rule of thumb should be that you really don't need to go more than $5 in most cases. And in fact, as we noted, you'd be better served not going more than $5. Actually is a better result. On the B2B side, it really opens up a whole new issue. Incentives can be anywhere from nothing, which actually a zero incentive can work very, very well in many kind of B2B situations, to studies where an appropriate incentive might be in the range of several $100s, and either paid directly to the respondent or paid to let's say an industry a fund or cause that is of interest to the individual. So the B2B world's a whole different situation. In the consumer world, it's a little bit easier to address that issue.
Okay. Thank you, John. One more here I'm getting is about pre-testing. Is there a certain percentage I guess the person is asking, is there a certain number from your overall sample that you need to use for your pre-test?
Well, there are, I have never seen any absolutes on this. I think there are some general kind of rules of thumb that people tend to follow, and usually about a 10%, 10% of the target sample is usually a pretty good number in terms of pretest. But people have different. It's kind of like scale construction. Everybody has their own ideas, but we generally try to follow about a 10% sampling.
Okay, yeah, that's about right, and it depends on the size of your sample as well. In my experience, depending on the size, we can increase it, and then there are different level of pre-testing as well from my side.
So for example, if you're doing a stratified sample, you might have to do a larger pretest than a random sample.
Exactly. This here is about. I think you covered that earlier. I don't remember which slide. about leading the witness question type. I think I saw that in one of your slides.
Yeah, we had a question. You often see this in political questionnaires. You know, like, you know, do you think Donald Trump is the greatest president we've ever had, and that Obama was the worst president we've ever had? You know, those kind of questions are just kind of ridiculous. But you can also see it in subtle ways in other types of questions, and it particularly becomes a problem in using almost any kind of adjective. So you need to be very careful in your use of adjectives, you know, or adverbs like very, or any kind of descriptor that's used in the question. And so it's usually much better just to leave it with a noun or as simple a sentence as possible to make sure that we're not kind of leading the witness even subtly.
It's interesting. One of the things that I've noticed you talked about is about don't knows. You know, there's you know, the school of thought initially was you always want to provide an option to the respondent so that you're not forcing their hands. But in your case, you mentioned that putting a don't know is a quick cop out or something to that effect. What's the balance there?
Yeah, in most cases we would recommend a don't know. Not using a don't know because it's easy to use that as a fallback, and it makes the response easier. You know, I don't need to stop and think about it. Just put a don't know. So if I have any hesitation at all, I just click that and move on. The exception to that, I think, would be when you're dealing with surveys that are a little more, actually a little more complex. If you're dealing with technology issues, or if you're dealing with instances where different individuals may have different levels of knowledge. And so if you're, for example, with a complex process or product where, let's take a cell phone, for example. If you're talking about functionality on the cell phone, some people may not use many of the functions on that phone, where others might be very comfortable with some of the more unusual kind of features or feature sets. And so in that kind of an instance, you know, a don't know may be very valuable information because they literally don't know. But when we're talking about, you know, opinion polls, that's kind of the other end of the spectrum. We definitely don't want to include a don't know there because we want that opinion.
Okay. And here's another question that's coming in about straight liners. How do you deal? I think I know what the person's trying to say, but how do you deal about people who are straight lining their answers in the survey? So I guess a good way to paraphrase it is to say, you know, you have a grid question, and perhaps the respondent is just randomly picking answer option in a particular order that you know, where they're straight lining. And how do you typically deal with that? Because it seems like a lot of people are dealing with that issue sometimes.
Yeah, it's a hard one because it's you know, kind of like the speed question earlier. You know, you've got kind of professional survey takers out there, and you know, we want to design the questionnaires so they're easy for the legitimate people to answer, which means you know, alignment of radio buttons and things like that. So it is easy for people to answer, but that also makes it easy for the cheats to get in there in straight line or Christmas tree or whatever they're going to do. Okay. You know, one thing that you can do is build in some logic into the questionnaire to where if there are X number of responses that are similar. So let's say we get 5, you know, ones in a row. You know, you might have a pop-up that says it looks like you're answering consistently. You know, and give them some direction or give them a little nudge, or you know, just interrupt the thought process a little bit and communicate to them that they can't do that.
All right, awesome. I think this is it for us because we're running out of time. We have about a minute left. Thank you again, everyone, for you know, joining us for this presentation, and thank you again, John. I know we had a few glitches here and there, but glitches happen. This is the world that we live in, so it's not an issue. Everything went smoothly. This webinar will be posted on, the recording will be on our website, questionpro.com. So please feel free, shoot us an email if you have difficulty downloading it or whatnot. And thank you for your time, and you all have a good day.
Thank you, really good to be a part of this.
All right, bye-bye.